I was very fortunate. I got started very early in life on a mystical path. I had a grandmother who was a witch, an herbalist, and when I was a very small child, she explained about fairies and ghosts and that sort of thing. And it gave me a sort of a rational, experiential way to look at the unseen, and that was very fortunate. I grew up a very heavily Calvinist, foot-washing Baptist, hard-shell, Protestant, nothing in the world but God and the devil. And I early on realized that that probably wasn't very accurate or very worthwhile perception to have. So when I lost my religion, I went to pure science. I was a materialist, a rationalist. If I couldn't do the numbers, it didn't exist. And then in college, I began to explore the shamanic realms and discovered that even though we couldn't see it, it did exist. And also my fascination with history. My grandfather was Scottish. He came from Scotland, the Isle of Skye, in 1910 to a little small town in South Carolina where a lot of his clan, his family members, had started a sort of little community. They were all into cotton mills. That's what they did. They brought the weaving and spinning expertise from northern England and New England down to the south and started cotton mills. So my grandfather from an early age would read to me from Catherine Porter's Scottish Chiefs and would explain who among our local group had been on the side of the Bruces and who had been the Bruces' enemies in the Scottish Civil War, and that's how you should act. You should never trust a common, etc. So that was my origins in history, is that it was sort of, I don't know, force-fed to me before I had any real way of even discussing it rationally. And by the time I got to college, I started out in English. And I won a prize to study Shakespeare at Oxford for the winter term and then to do the spring term at Stratford-on-Avon. And I blew that off. Being very young and the time of the world it was, I decided that the last thing I wanted to do was waste time at Oxford. So there was a rather beautiful young lady who convinced me that we should run off to Paris until the money ran out. And so that was my first brush for Shakespeare, and if I hadn't decided to run off to Paris and blow it off, I would be a Shakespeare professor at some small college in the United States and be very dull and boring. Then later I worked for the North Carolina Shakespeare Festival, and I found that quite satisfying. And if I hadn't had a boss that thought nonprofit theater companies were just a lovely scam to enrich himself and not really a way to do service to humanity, and he fired me, I would still be writing introductions to Shakespeare's plays for rednecks in central North Carolina. So my current book on Shakespeare in D is sort of like the third go-around with Shakespeare. Hopefully we'll get it all out of my system this time. I'm sort of your original independent thinker. I went to college and graduate school just long enough to learn how to do research, use the library, primary sources, secondary sources, and so forth. And then I waved goodbye and never looked back. Traveled a lot, Tibet, India, Egypt. I would pick a field of study and get as deep into it as I felt was necessary, and when I'd wrap that one up, I'd move on to another. One of my major interests all the way from college has been southern France, the Holy Grail, those kind of Grail legends. And that's sort of been the thread running through all of my historical researches is, what was this really about? When did it start? What are we really talking about? What's the history? Who are the people? So I've done a lot of work in that. In the late 80s, early 90s, I completely shifted focus and went into more psychology. And I worked with binaural sound and light entrainment to help seriously dysfunctional individuals. and had a great deal of success with that. But since I have no degree in psychology, have no degree really in anything, that sort of got me on the bad side of the medical authorities. You can't help people unless you have the proper credentials on your wall, no matter how efficient you are at it. So in the late 90s, I backed off of that and just went strictly to writing. Other than the Shakespeare Festival, I've never had a real job. I've been a freelance writer since the time I was 16. I published my first newspaper articles at 16. Spent a lot of time writing rock and roll reviews and that sort of thing in the 70s. And then in the 80s, I turned to more technical writing, things that you could actually get paid for writing. And while I was doing the psychology in the 90s, I didn't write so much. And then toward the end of the 90s, I started writing on Fulcanelli and Alchemy, published 2 books, Monument to the End of Time and Mysteries of the Great Cross at Hendaye. And that sort of led to an expansion of my field and my awareness into more esoteric subjects. And along the way, I had the good luck to meet a fellow by the name of Francis Israel Regarde, who had connections to the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley in the 30s. And I went to talk to him about my theories on the Tarot. And he very kindly says, yes, I believe your theories are correct. However, if you really want a field of study, look at this John Dee and the Enochian. And that's sort of been, I haven't looked back since. So I've gone through all of John Dee's work. I've looked literally at every scrap of paper that's even been remotely attributed to John Dee. And I put together a coherent synthesis based on the idea that the angels were actually giving John Dee a form of computer, hardware and software, and that the computer was a form of radio or internet, that the purpose of what the angels gave Dr. Dee was to create a communication device, in the sense that if you're on a desert island and you want to be rescued, and this earth is sort of a desert island, as beautiful as it is, then you need a way to communicate with the rescue forces. And then once you communicate with them, they'll explain to you how to build a boat and get off the island. So the thrust of my work over the last couple of decades has been trying to put the Enochian material into some sort of context that it wouldn't be completely woo-woo, it wouldn't be completely, oh, isn't that bizarre? Most academics think that John Dee was a really brilliant scientist and mathematician. Oh, and he kind of got off the track a little bit when he started talking to those angels. And I think it's the other way around. He was the most brilliant person of his time, and he learned all that he could from human science, human knowledge. And very logically, well, what's the next source? Well, higher beings, beings that have more awareness, longer term, and that led him into the angelic communications. And part of my discoveries in trying to build a coherent system out of the Enochian is the fact that the Enochian is based in fourth dimensional geometry, fourth dimensional mathematics, a concept that Dee understood poetically but didn't have the math to actually determine. Well, in the last 70 years or so, we've developed all the math necessary to outline all of these figures in 4 dimensions, and guess what? Those figures are exactly the same as the shapes and concepts that the angels gave to Dr. Dee in the 1580s. So there's a 420-year gap there that apparently Dee himself was quite aware of, that this information was not for his time, it was for the next planetary age after his, roughly 420 years from the 1580s, which would be now. And Nostradamus also had a similar perception. One of his most accurate predictions was that his work would be much more famous and much better understood 500 years after his birth than it ever was during his lifetime or during that intervening 500 years. So I've been very lucky in focusing on that 16th century era, which contained both Queen Elizabeth and John Dee and Shakespeare and Nostradamus and Rudolph II and Philip II, and all these truly amazing personalities. And the work that they did created the basis for the world we're in now. And the basic problem is, how do we get out of this rather dysfunctional world we've created for ourselves. And it's my belief, and I hope I have some science to back it up, that the angels actually explain to us how we get out of this hole we're in. And that they were just waiting for 400 years for our math and our comprehension of science to catch up with what they gave us in the 1580s. In the last few years, I've been doing a lot of TV work on Nostradamus. I've done 8 Nostradamus specials. The last one was entitled Nostradamus in 2012, and it'll be playing all summer on History Channel International, all over Europe, all over the world, as a prologue to the big Hollywood, big budget movie that's coming out later this summer about 2012. And so far, over 100 million people worldwide have watched that one Nostradamus special. But I also was the chief speaker and the main guide and producer for Nostradamus 500 Years Later. That's the best documentary about Nostradamus' life and work. And I've done The Lost Book of Nostradamus. I've been the Nostradamus expert on a show about a fellow that they're calling the new Nostradamus, who does sort of role-playing algorithms with real people and politics and situations. So I've done a lot of TV work on Nostradamus from various aspects. And if you Google my name, if you want to know what I'm famous for, it's the Nostradamus connection. And I finally discovered exactly how many people it takes to satisfy my ego, and it's somewhere around 60 million.